They were loud. Multiple conversations in multiple languages created a wall of sound that hit Salex like an anvil. He had studied human linguistics. He knew that Earth had over 7,000 languages, though most were dying, replaced by a handful of dominant tongues. He had not understood what that meant until now. He could hear at least 10 distinct languages being spoken in the immediate vicinity. Probably more. Some were languages he recognized: Standard English, Mandarin, Arabic, Hindi. Some were languages he had heard of but never heard spoken: Swahili, Japanese, a clicking language that his translator identified as Kosa. Some were languages that didn't appear in any council database, that humans had developed on their colony worlds, that mixed Earth languages with new words for new concepts on new worlds. Some humans were laughing. Some were arguing. Some were conducting what appeared to be business deals right there at the table, tablets exchanging hands, fingers gesturing at screens. One human was sleeping, her head on her folded arms, and the human next to her was carefully placing a small paper object on her head while she slept. Salex's tail began tapping. And then he saw it. The incongruity that made his brain stutter mid-step. In a section designated for the colony on Felix Prime, among the human representatives, sat what was very clearly not a human. She was covered in fur. Not human hair, not the close-cropped fur of a primate, but a coat of short, sleek fur that shifted between gold and brown as she moved. Her face was distinctly feline, triangular ears that swiveled independently, a short muzzle, whiskers that twitched as she surveyed the room. Her eyes were large, yellow, with vertical pupils that contracted and expanded as she scanned her surroundings. And behind her, wrapped around her chair in a motion that was almost liquid, was a tail. Long, furry, twitching. Salex leaned toward Wazak, not taking his eyes off the anomaly. "You handled Felix Prime," he said, keeping his voice low. "Why is there a Flesian sitting with the human delegation?" Wazak's throat sac swelled with what Salex had learned to recognize as embarrassment. "That is a Flesian," Wazak confirmed. His voice had the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news. "She is also the human ambassador." Salex stared. "She has fur. And a tail." "Yes. She is very clearly not human." Wazak's throat sac swelled further. "The humans on that planet elected her. There is nothing we can do." Salex watched as the Flesian ambassador, who was, by any reasonable definition, a cat, lifted one paw and began grooming her arm with long, deliberate licks. Her tongue rasped against her fur. She seemed completely unconcerned with the galactic politics unfolding around her. "Is this," Salex said slowly, "related to their obsession with cats?" Wazak's silence was answer enough. "Of course it is," Salex muttered. He forced himself to look away from the ambassador, who had now begun grooming her other arm. "Of course it is." He forced himself to overcome the shock of humanity's diversity. He forced his legs to move. He forced his tail to still. He walked to the center of the semicircle. Each step felt longer than the last. The table was truly massive, wrapping around him in a gentle curve that put hundreds of human faces in his field of vision simultaneously. Some were watching his approach. Others were still engaged in their own conversations, apparently unaware or unconcerned that the committee director had entered the room. He could hear them. The arguments hadn't stopped. The business deals hadn't paused. The human who had been sleeping was now awake, looking around with the confused expression of someone who had just woken in a place they didn't recognize. The paper object had migrated from her head to her shoulder, where it clung with improbable persistence. Salex reached the center point. The focal position. The spot where the semicircle's geometry would carry his voice to all assembled. For just a moment, he hesitated. So many eyes. Then he straightened his spine. He activated the vocal amplification system built into the floor. He spoke. "Ambassadors of humanity." His voice boomed across the hall, amplified by the Goratha's acoustics, by the council's technology, by the sheer weight of the moment. Conversations stopped. Faces turned. The sound of 1,000 human voices, which had filled the space like a physical presence, collapsed into silence. "My name is Director Salex of the Species Integration Committee." You have been summoned here to address a critical requirement of your provisional membership in the Galactic Council. He let the words settle. He watched the faces. Some were attentive. Some were suspicious. Some were, he checked, still conducting business, though at least the volume had dropped. Every species that joins the Council must provide comprehensive documentation of their weapons systems and technologies. This serves multiple essential purposes. He began to list them, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. It allows us to calibrate security systems across Council space. It enables our peacekeeping forces to properly respond to threats and criminal activity. It permits the development of appropriate rules of engagement and conflict resolution protocols. And it ensures that all member species operate with a basic level of transparency that is foundational to galactic peace. He paused. The hall was quiet now. Truly quiet, for the first time since he had entered. Humanity presents a unique challenge in this regard. Your species is fragmented across hundreds of sovereign entities. Each has independent military capabilities. Each has proprietary technologies. Each has information that is not shared even among your own kind. A murmur ran through the assembly. Several ambassadors were already shaking their heads. One, the Flesian ambassador, had stopped grooming herself and was now staring at Salex with her large yellow eyes. Her tail had gone still. This fragmentation has made the standard documentation process impossible to complete through conventional channels. The murmur grew louder. Therefore, Salex said, his voice cutting through the rising noise, this committee is making the following requirement. He paused. He let the silence build. He looked at the faces. We present them with the requirement. We make it clear that the exit door does not open until they produce a complete weapons inventory. Full documentation, descriptions, pictures, diagrams, schematics, operational parameters, everything. He raised a second hand to forestall the objections he could already see forming on Zophar's face. I know what you are thinking. They will refuse. They will argue. They will claim it is impossible, just as Zophar has outlined. And you are right. He let that settle. Individually, they will. But we will not be asking them individually. We will be asking them collectively, in front of each other, with the entire galaxy watching. He stood. His full height was still shorter than Hara even when she was seated, but his presence filled the room nonetheless. The holographic display flickered as he moved, the impossible web of human weapons development casting light across his scales. Humans have a particular characteristic, he said. They are intensely competitive with each other. If we make this a public challenge, if we make it clear that their integration depends on their ability to cooperate, they will be forced to prove they can do it. No single human can produce this list. But all of them together. He let the question hang. They will have no choice but to try. It should work, he continued, pacing slowly around the table. We establish the requirement publicly. We make it a matter of record that humanity's council membership depends on this documentation. We give them a deadline. 1 week, perhaps. Long enough to be reasonable, but short enough to maintain urgency. He stopped, turning to face them. And critically, we make it their problem to solve. Not ours. Wazak was the first to respond. His throat sac inflated slowly, then deflated. It shifts the burden of proof, he said. Then, after a pause, though I have one concern. What if they simply refuse en masse? Salex nodded, acknowledging the point. Then we make it clear, publicly and unequivocally, that the integration process terminates. We have given them every opportunity. We have been more than reasonable. And if they cannot meet this basic requirement, a requirement we have placed on every species in the Council's history, then they have disqualified themselves. He looked at Hara. The political damage you mentioned still occurs. But we will have documentation proving we did everything possible. Zophar's antennae quivered, his multiple eyes blinking in an asynchronous pattern that indicated deep thought. I accept the logic, he said slowly, though I have a different concern. He gestured to the holographic display, which still showed the web of human governance. Where do we house this meeting? 553 ambassadors. plus their staff, plus security, plus the documentation they will need to produce. Even our largest conference facilities are not designed for gatherings of that size. Salex's tail tapped once, twice. We will find a venue, he said, with more confidence than he felt. The council has relationships with hundreds of species. Someone will have a facility large enough. We make it work because we have to. Hara's long fingers steepled together, creating a cage of bones that rose above the table like a monument. My observation is more practical, she said. We need to control the narrative. When we issue this summons, when we make this demand, it needs to come from the council president's office. We need the full authority of the council behind us, or the humans will simply ignore it as bureaucratic overreach. Salex considered this. Then he nodded. Agreed. I will draft the proposal for the president this evening. He looked at each of them. Any other concerns? Silence answered him. The kind of silence that meant assent rather than confusion. Zophar's eyes had returned to their resting positions. Wazik's throat sac was still. Hara's fingers had unfolded. Then we are agreed, Salex said. We summon the humans. All of them. He looked at the holographic display one more time. The impossible web, the red nodes of black projects, the individual faces of humans who hoarded weapons in basements and garages. And we see if they are capable of the cooperation their council membership requires. As the meeting adjourned and his colleagues filed out, Salex remained seated. His tail resumed its unconscious tapping against the floor. Tap tap. Fizz. He was thinking about the implications. About the sheer logistical challenge of what he had just proposed. Finding a venue large enough for 553 human ambassadors, plus their entourages, plus the committee members, plus council observers. The main assembly hall of the Galactic Council could accommodate one representative for each sapient species in the galaxy fairly well. All 200 of them could fit with room to spare. It would not be large enough for all the human factions. One species. Not even fully integrated yet, requiring more space than the entire rest of the galaxy combined. It was absolutely ridiculous. And yet, somehow, it was perfectly appropriate for humanity. His tail kept tapping. The 3 months that followed were exhausting in ways Salex had not anticipated. It was not the bureaucratic challenges, though those were substantial. The council's administrative machinery was designed for efficiency, for the smooth processing of species integration across decades of careful negotiation. It was not designed for the particular chaos that humanity brought with it. No, what exhausted Salex was the sheer volume of communication required. Every one of those 553 human governments had questions. Everyone had concerns. Everyone needed to be convinced, cajoled, or in some cases subtly threatened into participation. And every single one of them believed, with the unshakable certainty that only humans seemed to possess, that their particular situation was unique. Wazik had taken the parliamentary democracies. It had seemed like a good allocation at the time. Wazik's species, the Veth, had developed parliamentary government 3,000 years before encountering the council. They understood coalition building. They understood the delicate art of convincing multiple factions to agree on something none of them wanted. They understood why it sometimes took 17 votes to decide what to have for lunch. What Wazik had not understood was the sheer number of parliamentary democracies humanity had invented. There were the Westminster systems, with their ceremonial monarchs and elected parliaments. Because if you are stating that no human can provide a list of their own weapons, the logical conclusion is that their species can never be integrated into the Galactic Council. The requirement exists for every member species. It has existed for millennia. If humanity cannot meet it, they cannot join. He leaned forward, and the moisture field rippled with the motion. Consider the implications, Zophar. Wazik's voice rose, his throat sac inflating further. Without a weapons registry, how do we calibrate security scanners at spaceports? Humans are already traveling through council space. They are already establishing trade routes. How do we know what to look for? He didn't wait for an answer. How do we train peacekeeping forces to recognize and respond to human weaponry? Our forces are trained to identify the weapons of all member species. If we cannot provide them with human weapons data, they will be fighting blind. His voice rose even more. The moisture field was trembling now, tiny droplets forming on its surface. How do we establish rules of engagement? How do we determine what constitutes reasonable force in disputes involving humans? How do we prosecute weapons violations when we have no baseline for what should or shouldn't be present? He slammed a webbed hand on the table. The holographic display flickered. Humans are simply not suitable for galactic integration. That is the hard truth. When Wazik finished, Salex could see the pair of air sacs beneath his colleague's jaw, inflating and deflating rapidly. The translucent skin of his neck distended, the purple circulatory vessels clearly visible beneath. It was a consequence of how much he had spoken, how much oxygen his frail amphibian body had expended on words that, while true, did not bring them any closer to a solution. Salex's tail kept tapping. A third voice entered the conversation, and Salex didn't need to look up to know it was Hara. She was, quite literally, impossible to ignore. At twice their collective height, a consequence of evolving on a low-gravity world where vertical growth was unconstrained by the normal limits of skeletal density, she had to lean forward to truly participate in their discussions. Her elongated arms rested on the table surface, her weight distributed across all 4 of her 3-jointed fingers. Each finger was nearly as long as Salex's entire forearm. Her species, the Gorath, were one of the oldest members of the Council. They had achieved spaceflight while most species in the galaxy were still figuring out agriculture. They had seen empires rise and fall, stars ignite and die, civilizations ascend to the Council and be forgotten. Hara herself was old enough to remember when the Council had only 40 member species. There is another dimension to this problem, she said quietly. Her 3-jointed fingers drummed against the table in a slow, contemplative rhythm. The sound was like stones falling on stone. Humanity has already begun their integration process, Hara continued. They have provisional membership, limited trading rights. They have established embassies on Council worlds. Their diplomats attend Council functions. Their ships travel through Council space. In the eyes of the galaxy, they are already part of the community. She paused, letting that sink in. A failure to complete their integration would not be seen as a problem with humans and their species. Another pause. Her fingers stopped drumming. It would be seen, universally and unequivocally, as a failure of this committee. Salex noticed the individual reactions immediately. All of them were staring at him. Zophyr had oriented 4 of his 6 eye stalks in Salex's direction, the other 2 scanning the room as if seeking escape routes. Wazik's throat sacs had deflated, but his fingers were pressed flat against the table, his whole body tensed as if preparing to leap. Hara remained leaning forward, her enormous frame creating a shadow that fell across half the table. Her expression was unreadable, but her posture demanded response. Salex's tail stilled. His mind worked through the problem coldly and methodically, the way it had been trained to do across decades of diplomatic service. He ran through the questions in order, each one building on the last. Question: could any single human produce a complete list of their species' weapons? Zophyr had made that abundantly clear. The fragmentation was too complete, the secrecy too ingrained. Question: could the humans collectively produce such a list? Answer: unknown. Theoretically possible. Humans had, in moments of existential threat, demonstrated remarkable capacity for cooperation. But this was not an existential threat. This was bureaucracy. Question: what force could compel hundreds of fractious human governments to cooperate? Answer: self-interest. Specifically, the threat of losing something they wanted. Council membership. Trade rights. Status. Question: what mechanism could ensure that cooperation was genuine rather than performative? Answer: public accountability. Mutual human oversight. If the humans had to produce their list in front of each other, with the entire galaxy watching, they would have to be honest. They would have to share what they knew. Question: would they share everything? Salex's tail began tapping again. That was the question, wasn't it? Would humans, forced to choose between secrecy and council membership, choose to reveal their most closely guarded technologies? He thought about the war archives, the bucket, the 3 hours debating table shapes, the cat memes. He thought about how humans, when cornered, did not fold. They fought. They innovated. They found ways to win that no other species would even consider. He thought about how dangerous that made them. And he thought about how his job was to integrate them anyway. There may be a way to solve this. Salex's voice cut through the silence, and he saw the immediate shift in his colleagues' postures. Zophar's eye stalks oriented fully toward him. Wazik's fingers relaxed slightly. Hara's fingers resumed their slow drumming. He looked at each of them in turn, his reptilian features settling into an expression of raw, unfiltered determination. We summon the human ambassadors. He paused. All of them. Zophar's eye stalks swiveled in confusion. All of whom? All the human ambassadors, Salex said. Representatives from all 553 individual human leaderships. Countries. Kingdoms. Corporate states. Autonomous collectives. Whatever other governance structures they have invented across their space. He leaned forward, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had cultivated over decades of navigating council bureaucracy. We bring them together in one big room. He raised a hand, ticking off points. There was the colony that had no government at all, having decided that government was unnecessary and that humans could organize themselves through voluntary cooperation. Their representative had spent 3 hours explaining their system to Salex, after which Salex had understood it less than when he started. There was the colony that had elected a cat. Not a human who was metaphorically a cat. Not a representative from the cat-obsessed colony that had sent the feline ambassador. An actual cat. A 4-legged, tail-wagging, litterbox-using domestic feline who had been elected mayor of a human settlement on a world called Omicron 9 and had somehow become the planet's de facto representative to the council. Salex had stared at the image for a long time. The cat had stared back. Salex had closed the file and moved on. But despite everything, despite the parliamentary procedures and the corporate secrets and the floating birthdays and the cats, the work got done. Ambassadors were selected. Governments were convinced. Travel arrangements were made. The Gorath, Hara species, had offered the use of their ceremonial hall. It was a structure designed for gatherings of their own kind, beings 3 times Salex's height, who measured space in terms of grandeur rather than efficiency. It was the only facility in council space that could accommodate the sheer number of humans who would be attending. Renting it had required negotiations that made Salex question his career choices. The Gorath did not rent their ceremonial hall. They loaned it on rare occasions for events of sufficient significance. Determining whether the integration of humanity qualified as sufficient significance had taken 3 weeks of negotiation, 2 formal ceremonies, and a dinner that had lasted 7 hours and involved foods that Salex was fairly certain had been alive when they were served. But they had secured it. Now, standing before the door of the Great Hall, Salex felt a wave of exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Behind him, his colleagues waited. Wazik's moisture field was shimmering more than usual, a sign of stress. Zophar's eye stalks were all oriented toward the door, his 4 arms folded so tightly they looked like they might snap. Hara stood at her full height, which was to say she was barely fitting in the corridor, her expression unreadable. "I am not ready for this," Wazik said quietly. "The moment we walk through that door and tell them they cannot leave until they produce a complete weapons inventory, we become the villains of whatever disaster follows." Zophar's antennae quivered. "That is precisely why we are doing it publicly. When they fail, and I maintain they will fail, it needs to be absolutely clear that the fault lies with human fragmentation, not with bureaucratic overreach on our part. If they fail," Hara corrected. Her tone suggested she agreed with Zophar's assessment, but her words left the door open. "They will fail," Zophar said flatly. "Humans always find a way to fail. And they always do it in the most spectacular, the most bizarre, the most inconvenient way possible." Salex said nothing. He simply placed his hand on the door's access panel and pushed forward, leading the way inside with a confidence he absolutely did not feel. The interior of the Great Hall was as impressive as the Gorath had promised, and as overwhelming. The Gorath had designed it for beings 3 times Salex's height. The ceiling soared overhead at a dizzying distance, lost in shadows that the hall's ambient lighting couldn't quite penetrate. Massive pillars, each carved from a single piece of stone that had been quarried from the Gorath homeworld before most council species had achieved spaceflight, rose at intervals throughout the space. The stone was pale, almost luminous, and the carvings that covered every surface depicted the Gorath's history, their emergence from the primordial seas, their first steps on their homeworld's moons, their discovery of other species, their ascension to the council. It was beautiful. It was ancient. It was absolutely, completely unsuited for what the committee had done to it. The enormous semicircular table that now dominated the space was not Gorath-made. It had been fabricated by council contractors over the past 6 weeks, shipped in pieces, and assembled by a team of engineers who had spent 3 days arguing about whether the curve was mathematically correct. The table was human-sized, designed for beings who sat rather than stood, who needed surfaces at waist height rather than chest height. Around it, in dense rows that circled the semicircle's outer edge, were chairs. Human chairs. Hundreds of them. 553, to be precise, plus spares. And filling those chairs were humans. So many humans. Salex had seen humans before, of course. He had met with human diplomats. He had attended human cultural events. He had, on one memorable occasion, been invited to a human wedding and had spent 6 hours watching humans consume a fermented beverage, dance in increasingly complex patterns, and eventually attempt to throw the person who had been married into a body of water. He had thought he understood human diversity. He had been wrong. The humans in this room were every shade of skin color Salex had encountered in his decades of diplomatic service, and several he hadn't. Some were the pale pinkish beige of the northern continents on Earth. Some were the deep brown of the equatorial regions. Some were the golden tan of the Mediterranean. Some were colors that didn't appear on Earth at all, the result of generations on worlds with different suns, different atmospheres, different evolutionary pressures. Their clothing was equally diverse. There were humans in formal suits that looked uncomfortably restrictive, the fabric dark and the lines sharp. There were humans in flowing robes embroidered with precious metals, the patterns so intricate that Salex's eyes struggled to parse them. There were humans in military uniforms bristling with incomprehensible insignia, ribbons and medals and pins that apparently communicated rank and achievement and something humans called unit pride. There were humans in simple tunics that suggested either poverty or philosophy, and Salex could not tell which. And the hair. Salex had received briefings on human hair. He had seen images. But seeing it in person at this scale was something else entirely. Long hair. Short hair. Hair that was obviously absent. Hair that had been colored in shades that definitely did not appear in human genetics. Blue, green, purple, a shade of pink that hurt to look at. Hair that had been shaped into sculptures that defied gravity, that rose from human scalps in spikes or curls or geometric patterns. Hair that was being actively cut by one human in the front row, who appeared to be giving himself a trim with a small device while simultaneously arguing with the human next to him. And they were loud. His forearms were folded across his chest. In cell physiology, this was a gesture of profound frustration. The limbs that evolution had designed for manipulation and tool use were being deliberately restrained from throwing things. Salex had learned to read Zophar's moods through those arms. Today, they were very folded. Director Salex, Zophar began, and already Salex could hear the carefully controlled tension in his voice. We must address the fundamental impossibility of our current task. He paused, allowing 2 of his eye stalks to swivel directly toward Salex while the others continued scanning the room. The fragmentation of human society is not a mere inconvenience. It is an absolute barrier to obtaining the weapons declaration we require. One of Zophar's hands gestured toward the table, and a holographic display flickered to life above the surface. It showed a map of human space, or rather, what humans called human space. Salex had seen this map before, but it never failed to induce a kind of cognitive vertigo. The display was not a simple map. It was a web, a labyrinth. a visual representation of chaos given form. As an example, Zofar continued, consider the structure of their civilization. He zoomed in on Earth, the human homeworld. They maintain over 550 distinct governmental entities across their colonies. Each claims sovereignty. Each maintains its own military apparatus. Each has its own laws governing weapons development, deployment, and classification. He zoomed further. Within those entities exist subgovernments, states, provinces, autonomous regions, municipalities. Many of these develop their own security technologies independent of their nominal overlords. A city on their homeworld called, he consulted a tablet. Los Angeles maintains a weapons development program that is technically subordinate to a larger entity called California, which is technically subordinate to an entity called the United States, but in practice, all three operate with significant autonomy and often develop competing technologies that they do not share with each other. Zofar's antennae quivered as he continued, warming to his subject. But the fragmentation does not stop at government structures. Human corporations, private entities driven purely by profit, develop weapon systems that they sell to the highest bidder. They often keep their most advanced specifications classified, even from the governments that purchase them. We have documented at least 80 major defense contractors across human space, each with proprietary technologies they guard as zealously as any state secret. The holographic display shifted, showing a dizzying web of interconnected nodes. Each node represented a weapons developer. The lines between them represented relationships, supply chains, licensing agreements, joint ventures, corporate espionage, and in at least 3 cases, actual warfare between competing companies. And beneath that layer, Zofar said, his voice dropping to a tone that Salex had learned to recognize as the prelude to bad news, we have what humans call black projects. Weapons development programs so classified that entire governments claim not to know they exist. Intelligence agencies operating in the shadows. Military units with budgets hidden in bureaucratic labyrinths. Research facilities that officially do not exist, developing technologies that officially have not been invented. The display zoomed in again, revealing a new layer of complexity. Red nodes that connected to nothing, that appeared and disappeared as Zofar cycled through data. Projects with names like Sentinel, Prometheus, and something in a human language that translated roughly to the quiet thing. Zofar's primary eyes fixed on Salex with an intensity that would have been uncomfortable if Salex hadn't spent decades in diplomatic service. That cell's 4 arms unfolded slightly, then refold, a gesture that in any other species would be a sigh. Then we arrive at the individual level, he said quietly. The holographic display zoomed to the smallest scale. Individual human faces appeared, each connected to lines of data. Director. Humans hoard weapons personally. They build them in basements and garages. They inherit them from ancestors who died generations before they were born. They hide them from their own governments out of what they call principle. They trade them in markets that operate entirely outside any legal framework. They modify existing weapons in ways that create entirely new categories of technology. They share instructions for building weapons over their planetary communication network, often with detailed diagrams and enthusiastic commentary. He let that settle. The conclusion is inescapable. Such a list does not exist. No single human on Earth or elsewhere possesses the knowledge, the access, or the authority to produce a comprehensive inventory of their species' weapons. He paused again, his eyes finally swiveling to meet each committee member in turn. And that is assuming they would be willing to share everything with us. All evidence suggests they would not. Salex said nothing. His scaled fingers remained still on the table surface, arranged in the careful pose he had cultivated to project calm authority. But beneath the table, where no one could see, the single bone at the tip of his reptilian tail tapped out an irregular rhythm against the floor. Tap tap, fuzz, tap tap tap. It was a vestigial trait, one that still manifested even after his species had abandoned physical combat entirely 30,000 years ago. His ancestors had used that tailbone as a weapon, whipping it against predators, against rivals, against anything that threatened them. It had been a weapon of last resort, deployed only when words had failed and flight was impossible. Now it merely betrayed his impatience. The silence stretched. Zophar's eyes had oriented back to their resting positions, scanning the room. The holographic display hovered between them, a monument to human impossibility. It was Wazak who finally broke the silence. The amphibian delegate straightened in his specially designed chair, the moisture field around him shimmering as he moved. His species required constant hydration. The field maintained a microclimate of humidity that allowed him to function in the dry atmosphere of council spaces. Without it, his skin would crack within hours. He stared at Zophar, his 2 yellow eyes. A typical number, Salek sometimes forgot how unusual Zophar's 6 eyes were, trying to locate what approximated a face on the multi-eyed being. "Are you proposing," Wazak said slowly, "that we abandon the integration of humanity entirely?" His throat sac inflated slightly, a sign of agitation. There were the presidential systems, with their separation of powers and periodic constitutional crises. There were the semi-presidential systems, which combined both models in ways that seemed designed to maximize confusion. There were the unicameral systems, the bicameral systems, and one notable case where a human nation had experimented with a tricameral legislature for 3 months before abolishing it in favor of a system that Salek still did not fully understand. And each of these systems had its own procedures, its own protocols, its own ways of saying no that could delay a decision for months while still technically following the rules. Wazak spent weeks navigating human political structures. He sent Salek's daily updates that grew progressively more despairing. Day 4, the representatives from the United Americas have agreed to attend, pending approval from their subcommittee on interstellar affairs. The subcommittee will convene in 2 weeks. Day 11, the subcommittee has convened. They have referred the matter to a working group. The working group will report back in 3 weeks. Day 25, the working group has reported. They recommend that the full legislature consider the matter. The legislature will debate the issue next month. Day 42, the legislature has debated. They have approved attendance by a margin of 312 to 287, with 41 abstentions. However, the minority has invoked a procedural rule that requires a second vote in 60 days. The second vote may overturn the first. This is apparently normal. Salek had read that update 3 times, then poured himself a drink from the small cabinet he kept in his office for exactly such occasions. Zophar had taken the corporate states and commercial entities. This, at least, had seemed like a natural fit. Zophar's species, the Tsel, had developed corporate governance structures that predated their spaceflight by millennia. They understood profit motives. They understood that corporations were not moral entities, but machines for the generation of value. They understood that a corporation's word was binding only until a better offer appeared. What Zophar had not understood was that human corporations had taken these concepts and weaponized them. There were the defense contractors, who had spent centuries competing for government contracts and had developed legal teams that could find loopholes in anything. There were the technology corporations who had weapon systems hidden inside consumer products and considered proprietary information more valuable than planetary security. There were the private military companies, who were technically corporations and technically not part of any government's military apparatus, and who technically did not exist in the official records of any human nation. And then there were the corporations that were also governments. The human colony on Titan, for example, was technically the property of a corporation called Helios Industries. The corporation had purchased the development rights from the United Americas government, established its own security forces, its own legal system, and its own weapons development program. When Zophar contacted Helios Industries about attending the meeting, he was informed that the corporation would send a representative, but that the representative's authority was limited to matters of commercial interest. Salek had asked what that meant. Zophar's response had been a single eye stalk oriented directly at the ceiling, which Salek had learned was the Tsel equivalent of staring into the void. Hara had managed the monarchies and traditional hierarchies. Her imposing presence translated well across communication channels. When Hara spoke, even through a view screen, beings listened. Her species had been old when the council was young. She had seen dynasties rise and fall. She had watched empires that lasted 10,000 years crumble into dust. Human monarchies, with their centuries of history and their carefully maintained traditions, should have been easy. The problem was that human monarchies had stopped being simple centuries ago. There were the constitutional monarchies, where the monarch reigned but did not rule, and the actual governance was handled by elected parliaments that often ignored the monarch entirely. There were the absolute monarchies, where the monarch ruled in fact as well as name, but had to navigate complex webs of tribal loyalties and religious authority that made council politics look simple. There were the elective monarchies, where the monarch was chosen by a council of nobles who often spent more time scheming than governing. There were the monarchies that were also theocracies, the monarchies that were also corporations, and one notable case where the monarch was a 9-year-old child who communicated entirely through social media. Hara handled them all with the patient efficiency of someone who had negotiated with beings who measured time in geological epochs. But even she had limits. Week 7, her report had read, "The representative from the Kingdom of Nai has informed me that she cannot attend because the date conflicts with her species' annual celebration of the monarch's birthday. I informed her that we could adjust the date. She informed me that the monarch's birthday is a floating holiday that changes each year based on the position of the stars. I asked when it would be this year. She did not know. The astrologers had not yet determined it. Salex had read that report, then read it again, then sent a message to Wazak asking if any of the human parliamentary democracies had ever considered simply having a fixed date for things. Wazak's response had been 3 paragraphs about the 1995 Canadian federal budget that Salex still did not understand. Salex had taken everything else. The theocracies, where weapons development was guided by interpretations of sacred texts that changed depending on which priest you asked. The military juntas, where the weapons inventory was considered a state secret of the highest order and revealing it was treason punishable by death. The anarchist collectives, where the concept of a weapons inventory was rejected on philosophical grounds and where the representatives communicated through consensus processes that took weeks to produce a single sentence. And the handful of truly bizarre governance structures that only humans could have invented. There was the colony that had organized itself as a direct democracy, where every decision was put to a vote of the entire population. Getting their representative to agree to anything required convincing a majority of 40,000 humans, each of whom had an opinion and a device to express it instantly. You collectively, as representatives of all human governance structures across known space, will produce a complete and comprehensive inventory of all weapons systems, technologies, and capabilities possessed by humanity. He raised his voice as the murmur became a rumble. This inventory will include detailed descriptions, visual documentation, technical schematics, operational parameters, and any other information necessary for the Council to properly integrate your species into our security frameworks. The murmur became a roar. Hands were raised. Voices called out. Someone was standing, gesturing angrily. Someone else was laughing. The Flesian ambassador had arched her back and was hissing. An actual hiss, the sound cutting through the noise like a blade. Salex spoke louder. This inventory will include everything from the simplest personal weapons to the most advanced military technologies. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons, exotic physics weapons, any other category of weaponized technology your species has developed. Weapons possessed by governments, by corporations, by private citizens, by criminal organizations. He paused for half a breath. Everything. Now they were shouting. Multiple languages competed for dominance. A man in a military uniform was on his feet, his face red, his voice rising. A woman in elegant robes was speaking rapidly into a communication device. 3 different fistfights had broken out in different sections of the assembly. Someone threw what appeared to be an expensive writing implement toward the center. It fell well short of Salex, clattering across the table. Salex pushed on, his amplified voice overwhelming theirs through sheer volume. You have 1 week. 7 standard galactic days. He let that land. This hall will be sealed once I leave. Food, water, and basic facilities will be provided. Communication with the outside is permitted and encouraged. You will need to contact your representative governments to gather this information. He paused. He let the silence, the sudden, shocked silence, stretch. But the doors will not open until you have produced the required documentation. The shouts became roars. A man was standing on his chair, yelling something about sovereignty. The fistfights had spread. Someone had climbed onto the table and was running, actually running, across the surface, leaping over data tablets and discarded writing implements. The Flesian ambassador had climbed onto her chair and was standing on her hind legs, her tail bristled to 3 times its normal size, her mouth open in a yowl that was definitely not diplomatic. Salex let them have their chaos. He waited. He counted to 10. Then he spoke again, and this time there was steel in his voice. Furthermore, understand that the entirety of the Galactic Council is watching this process. Your success or failure here will determine not just your species membership, but your reputation across the galaxy. He looked at the chaos, at the shouting, at the fighting, at the humans who were doing business deals even now, who were arguing and laughing and sleeping and at the Flesian ambassador, who had stopped yowling and was now watching him with an expression that was almost thoughtful. The choice is yours. Cooperate and join the council as full members, with all attendant rights and privileges. Or refuse and remain isolated from galactic civilization indefinitely. He let that hang in the air for 3 full seconds. I will return in exactly 1 week to receive your documentation. I expect it to be nothing less than complete. Comprehensive. Without gaps. The integrity of the council depends on it. The future of your species depends on it. He paused one final time. Do not disappoint me. Do not disappoint yourselves. Turned. He walked back toward the entrance. Behind him, he could hear them. The noise was deafening now. Screaming in a dozen languages. The sounds of furniture being moved, of something heavy being dragged across the table. Someone was crying. Someone else was laughing hysterically. Wazik and Zofar and Hara fell in behind him, their footsteps echoing on the ancient stone. As they reached the door, Salex glanced back one final time. 2 ambassadors were physically fighting, grappling with each other while their neighbors tried to pull them apart. A third had climbed onto the table and was gesticulating wildly while delivering what was probably a speech, though Salex couldn't hear it over the general chaos. The Flesian ambassador had climbed onto her chair and was standing on her hind legs, her tail bristling, her mouth open in a yowl that cut through everything. The door sealed behind them with a heavy, final sound. The corridor was suddenly, impossibly quiet. Salex stood there for a moment, his back against the door, letting the silence wash over him. That, he said finally, went about as well as could be expected. Zofar's eye stalk swiveled toward the door, then back to Salex. They are going to kill each other in there, he observed. Possibly, Salex agreed. He straightened, adjusting his robes. But if they do, it is not our fault. We gave them a clear task and clear parameters. What happens next is entirely on them. I still say they will fail, Zofar muttered. Salex said nothing. Deep in his chest, in the part of him that still carried the instincts of his predator ancestors, he felt an odd sensation. Not quite hope. Not quite dread. Something in between. They would find out in 1 week. The first day was exactly what Salex had expected. The security feeds showed a room in complete pandemonium. The humans had not organized themselves into factions, they had simply exploded. 553 individuals, each representing a government that had spent centuries developing its own weapons, its own secrets, its own reasons for not sharing either with anyone. For the first 6 hours, no one spoke to anyone outside their immediate delegation. The Americans clustered with Americans. The Chinese with Chinese. The Russians with Russians. The corporate delegations formed their own clusters, their representatives typing furiously on tablets, no doubt calculating what this would cost them. The Flesian ambassador, who was, Salex noted with a kind of exhausted resignation, named Whiskers, had claimed a corner of the room and was systematically grooming every inch of her fur, apparently unconcerned with the crisis unfolding around her. At hour 7, the first fight broke out. The delegations from India and Pakistan, two human nations that had, according to the files, fought multiple wars over a region called Kashmir, had been placed next to each other. Whether this was deliberate or a logistical error, Salex didn't know. What he knew was that at 1903 Galactic Standard Time, the Indian ambassador threw a data tablet at the Pakistani ambassador, and the Pakistani ambassador responded by emptying a carafe of water over the Indian ambassador's head. Within minutes, a dozen other delegations had joined in. By hour 10, the room looked like a battlefield. Chairs were overturned. Tablets were shattered. Someone had drawn something on the wall in what appeared to be lipstick. Salex zoomed in on the security feed and saw that it was a crude depiction of a human genital organ, with the words, "Council sucks," written beneath it. The Flesian ambassador had not moved from her corner. She was watching the chaos with the expression of a cat observing birds through a window, mildly interested, deeply unconcerned, and clearly waiting to see if anything worth chasing emerged. Salex watched the feeds for 12 hours before forcing himself to leave. There was nothing he could do. The doors were sealed. The humans were locked in. If they killed each other, they killed each other. His tail tapped against the floor as he walked away. By the second day, the chaos had subsided. Not because the humans had resolved their differences. Because they were hungry. The council had provided food, of course. Standard nutritional rations, the same kind that were provided to all diplomatic gatherings. They were nutritionally complete, engineered to meet the dietary needs of over 200 species, and utterly flavorless. Salex had eaten them for decades. He had stopped tasting them after the first year. The humans, it turned out, had opinions about the food. The security feeds showed humans approaching the food dispensers, retrieving their rations, and then, Salex watched in fascination, making faces. Actual faces. Contorting their features in what he had learned were expressions of disgust. Some humans pushed the food around their plates without eating. Some ate it with the grim determination of soldiers consuming battlefield rations. Some simply set the trays aside and did not eat at all. By midday, the hunger had made them quiet. The shouting had stopped. The fighting had stopped. The humans sat in their clusters, some of them visibly weaker, some of them staring at the food dispensers with expressions that Salex could only describe as longing. One delegation, the French, according to the seating chart, had begun a quiet, intense discussion that seemed to involve a lot of hand gestures and a lot of pointing at the food. At hour 30, the French ambassador approached the food dispenser, retrieved her ration, and then walked to the center of the room. She began to speak. Salex turned up the audio. "Cannot continue like this," she was saying. "The food is inedible. The accommodations are inadequate. The task before us is impossible. But none of that matters if we starve. So I am proposing," she paused, looking around the room, "that we pool our resources. Some of us have brought supplemental nutrition, personal supplies, things that are actually edible. If we share what we have, we can make the food palatable. If we do not share..." She let the sentence hang. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the Japanese delegation rose. Then the Italian. Then the Thai. One by one, delegations approached the center, carrying small packages, sealed containers, things they had brought from home. The American delegation produced a case of something called MREs, meals ready to eat, according to the translator, though the American ambassador's description was less polite. The Indian delegation produced spices. The Mexican delegation produced dried peppers. Within 2 hours, the center of the room had become a makeshift kitchen. Humans were cooking, not using the council's food dispensers, but combining what the council had provided with what they had brought, creating something new. The smell, Salex's translator helpfully informed him that the smell was garlic, cumin, chili, and something the translator could not identify but the humans seemed very excited about, drifted through the room. The Flesian ambassador had finally moved from her corner. She was sitting at the edge of the cooking area, her tail twitching, her eyes fixed on something a Brazilian delegate was preparing. At hour 34, the humans ate together. It was not peaceful. There was still arguing. There was still suspicion. The Indian and Pakistani delegations sat as far apart as possible. The American and Chinese delegations engaged in what appeared to be a staring contest across the table. But they ate the same food. They sat in the same room. And for the first time since the doors had closed, no one was fighting. Salex watched the feeds and felt something he couldn't quite name. The third day began with an argument about water. The council had provided water. Plenty of water. Water that had been filtered and purified and tested for contaminants. But the humans, some of them at least, refused to drink it. They wanted something else. Something with caffeine. Something with carbonation. Something that, according to one delegate from a place called Seattle, tasted like actual water and not whatever this purified nonsense is. The argument lasted 4 hours. It was resolved when a delegate from Canada produced a device that could, apparently, make any water drinkable by human standards. The device was passed around the room. Delegates filled their containers. The argument ended. And then, in the quiet that followed, something unexpected happened. Someone laughed. Salex checked the feed. It was the Australian delegate, a woman with sun-darkened skin and hair that had been bleached nearly white by exposure to her world's harsh sun. She was looking at the Canadian delegate's water purification device, and she was laughing. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever seen," she said. "You brought a water filter to a diplomatic summit." The Canadian delegate shrugged. "I've been to these things before. Council water tastes like nothing. I wasn't going to drink nothing for a week. You could have just brought bottled water like a normal person. And carry 50 cases of water across the galaxy? This was easier." The Australian delegate laughed again. And then, slowly, others began to laugh. Not at anyone. Not in mockery. Just laughing. The tension that had been coiled in the room for 3 days began to loosen. Someone else told a joke. Salex's translator struggled with it. Something about a council bureaucrat, a human engineer, and a weapon that fired cats, but the humans understood. They laughed harder. Someone else told a joke about the Flesian ambassador, who had, apparently, spent the first day grooming herself while the room descended into chaos. The Flesian ambassador, whiskers Salex forced himself to remember, looked up from her grooming, fixed the joke-teller with her yellow eyes, and then deliberately turned her back on him. The laughter became hysterical. For the rest of the day, the humans talked. Not about weapons. Not about the inventory. About home. About their worlds, their families, the things they missed. The American delegate talked about a place called Texas and something called barbecue. The Japanese delegate talked about cherry blossoms. The delegate from the Titan colony talked about the view of Saturn rising over the methane lakes.